Okay, we're back. Psych 100 students for Chapter 3. In Chapter 3, it's Biopsychology. Now, for those who like biology, you're going to really dig this chapter. For those who are not that crazy about biology, you're going to say, yikes, why are we studying all this medical stuff? This is like my biology class. Well, there's a lot of reasons. I think it's all about this. Brain. Use it. For too long, we see things of this nature. For example, during February, some of you might get a box of chocolates in this shape. You might have seen a sign that said something like this, right? But I think that we've got things quite wrong. I think that if we're going to get a box of chocolates in February for Valentine's Day, it should actually be shaped in the size of a brain. Forgive my artistry. I'm not an artist, but I do love art. And when you open it up, there should be a little chocolate brains inside. Because isn't that what it's really about? It's about the brain. And that's what this chapter is all about, the brain. Try this when you get a chance, maybe after this lecture. Go up to somebody you care about and say, I brain you. Watch their reaction. Because think about it, people have had transplants and of the heart, but have we had brain transplants? Just in the sci-fi movies, right? It's all about the brain. Speaking of affairs of the heart, this is an article I pulled off the newspaper just the other day. And by the way, when I say just the other day, that's implying at least 5 years, right? When I say some years ago, that means decades. So just the other day, what is this? February of 2012. Okay, that's a good while ago. It talks about the chemistry, the neurotransmitters when we think that we're in love. For example, let me read a couple of these for you. If you're the kind of person who's addicted to love, that's your dopamine really leading you. If you're the kind of person who gets that weird feeling when somebody you have a crush on walks into the room, that's norepinephrine. If you're a stalker, you don't have to raise your hand for that one. That's serotonin. So it's all about the brain. Excuse me. My brain told me I had a sneeze there. And it's all about neurotransmitters. Check this out. Look at these images I have on here. Of all the creatures you see on the screen, which one do you think is the smartest one of all? Now, some of you right away will say it's the chimps because you saw Planet of the Apes, right? But most of us would agree that it's the human being. Now, my question to you is why? Why would you choose human beings? Of course, we're biased, right? We're going to choose our own species. And some of you might even say, well, we have the bigger brain. So what are you saying? That size does matter? Well, think about it not just in size of brain, but in proportion. Take a look at this individual who came to visit me the other day. Now, some of you might recognize this as the child, or some call him or her Baby Yoda. Look at the size of the cranium, look at the size of the body. Right? I could have found an animal that had a much larger brain. As a matter of fact, I was going to put the blue whale on the bottom here, but it wouldn't fit. But when we measure the blue whale's brain in proportion to its body mass, and we measure our brain in proportion to our body mass, we proportionally have a larger brain. And this makes sense when we think of alien individuals who are more advanced than we are, right? Those large heads and the smaller bodies. As a matter of fact, I was at an American Psychological Association convention some years ago, and they had a panel where they were interviewing therapists who work with people who are allegedly kidnapped by extraterrestrials. And they said those individuals had large heads and small bodies, consistent with our theory, right? And of course, it really matters what you do with your brain, essentially, right? The prefrontal cortex plays a role in the case study I'm going to talk about, and his name is Phineas Gage. Some background information about this man, Phineas Gage. This case study takes place in the 1800s, and it takes place in the state of Vermont. Here's an image of Phineas Gage. What happens is Phineas is a railroad foreman, and most people describe him as pretty happy-go-lucky. Here is a life mask that was made in his lifetime of what he looked like. While clearing debris so another crew could lay down the tracks for a railroad, they employed the use of dynamite. They also used what's known as a tapping iron. It's a long metal piece about 1.5 inches in diameter. It's almost like a javelin, or a spear. It's flat on one end and pointy on the other. But imagine about 2.5, almost 3 feet of iron, like a spear. And they would take that tapping iron and smash it into the earth, make a hole, put a stick of dynamite, blow up the debris, whether it's a giant boulder or a trunk, and then clear the debris so another crew could come by and lay down the tracks. But when you're working with dynamite, you got to pay attention. Somebody didn't pay attention, and what they think happened was the dynamite was already inserted. They reinserted and hit the tapping iron. A spark ensued. The tapping iron shoots through Mr. Gage's head, completely through his head. He collapses. His fellow workers come to his aid, and they expect him to die. They send him by horse and wagon back to the small town. And the doctor examines him, one of the doctors, by sticking his finger on the top of his head here and the other finger there. And imagine this is inside my head to confirm that the tapping iron went all the way through his skull and his brain, thus damaging his prefrontal cortex. Now, remarkably, Phineas lives. And unfortunately, he's not able to go back to his job because he has probably some optic nerve damage. That's why you see that image where his eye is kind of closed, right? But his personality has changed drastically. He becomes super emotional. We believe that in the prefrontal cortex, there's a mechanism that kind of is like a faucet. It can turn on and off emotions. So when you said something funny to Phineas, he couldn't stop laughing. If you told a sad story, he couldn't stop crying. If you got him angry, he would cuss up a storm. One of his colleagues said, paraphrasing, quote, "He's more of a man than an animal," end quote. So Phineas made his way around the world. He stops in New York and is exhibited by P.T. Barnum, one of the greatest showmen of all time, as the man who had an iron rod shoot through his head. By the way, the tapping iron is engraved with his name and the date and what happened, and he keeps it as a souvenir. That's why you see him holding the tapping iron right here, right? He makes his way to South America, where he drives through the mountains a team of horses, right, doing deliveries by a wagon. And apparently over time, he mellowed out. He wasn't that explosive individual that he was initially with the brain damage. Fast forward approximately 12 years, he gets really sick and he catches a steamboat from South America to his family in San Francisco. His mother and sister are living there. He kind of recovers, but then he relapses, has some more seizures, and then dies. End of story. Buried by the San Francisco Bay. Not the end of story. Eventually, the doctor who initially examined him 12 years previous went looking for him and found that he was deceased and asked the family permission if he could dig up his bones and so he could use the skull as a form of study because he believed that the damage occurred in the frontal lobe. The family granted him permission, and lo and behold, when they opened up the casket, not only did he find his bones, but they found the engraved tapping iron. So we asked the family, can I have the skull and the tapping iron so I can teach other doctors? They granted him permission. The doctors that he lectured to didn't really believe his theory about damage in the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe, causing this loss of ability to control motion. So eventually the skull and tapping iron were donated to a museum called the Warren Museum in Harvard, that's owned by Harvard University. End of story. Not the end of story. The Damasios, a husband and wife team, asked permission for to borrow the skull and the tapping iron to study it carefully and superimpose computer imaging where exactly it entered, just below his left eye, off the top of his right top of his skull, and where the damage probably occurred in Phineas Gage. Well, they confirmed what the doctor originally thought. It was frontal lobe, it was a prefrontal cortex, and there is a mechanism that kind of controls our emotion. Voila. End of story. Not the end of story. Just the other day, or actually more like a few years ago, 2009, I got an email from a colleague who said, have you seen the photograph of Phineas Gage in the LA Times? And the first thing I thought was, there is no photograph of Phineas Gage. This is the only image we have of him. This publication that came out before that. So I looked at the LA Times, which I happen to have on my table, and I saw this image here. Apparently, this image was part of a website that bought, sold, and traded early photographic images, tintypes, stereographs, things of that, silver plates and so forth, things of that nature. And this one wasn't for sale, but they advertised it as the whaler holding his harpoon. And so, some people saw it online and said, you know what, I know about harpoons. That's not a harpoon he's holding. And somebody asked, could that be Phineas Gage? And they said, who that? So they Googled him. And then they realized, oh my goodness, the small little picture we have, let's blow it up. And when they blew it up, they looked at that image and they saw the writing on his tapping iron. And they said, I think we have the only known image of Phineas Gage. So now we know what he looks like. And that's why this magnet indicates what he looks like. Because right after that, they started selling magnets and postcards and posters of his image because he's a rock star. Now, I had a chance to meet Mr. Phineas Gage in person. Let me tell you about it with my next video. Thank you.